And we're live. It is Friday, April 8th, 5:05 p.m. Eastern Time. We are not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to hang out with Vlad Davidson. It is so nice to meet you. Person who I only know about because Ben has explained to me that you burned your passport.
With Thomas Ilves, no less.
With Thomas Ilves, who's one of our favorite members of the Greek chorus, and like, oh wow, oh that's really fun. Is that a picture of you and Thomas? Okay, correct. This is excellent. You're gonna have to maybe hold that up again in a second. But first,
all right, so let's start. Yeah, let's start with the who the hell is Vlad Davidson. We've got your bio on the show page. You have, I have to say, one of the most interesting bios of anybody we've had on the show recently. You're a New Yorker. You're from Odessa. You're Russian. You're Ukrainian. You're Jewish. Who the hell are you?
It's complicated. I barely know half the time also. I'm basically, I'm like a 19th century ruthless cosmopolitan, except I'm very
I was going to make that joke myself.
Yes, I preempt the criticism. I was born in Central Asia. I was born in Uzbekistan 3 weeks after the start of Perestroika. I'm a Perestroika baby. I was born to Ukrainian Jews who fled Hitler and one Russian grandmother from nomenclatura family. She was a Russian army officer's daughter. She was born in Batumi in Georgia. So for all four of my grandparents were born in different Soviet republics. I'm basically a Belarusian Ukrainian Jew. But I lived in Moscow as a kid. We immigrated to America when I was a little boy, and my family, we grew roots in America. I grew up in New York City, although I have some education from other places. And I grew up in the diaspora, in the Russian diaspora, and in a media family. My father is a media man. My father is in the media. He was in radio and television. I grew up in the diaspora, in the Russian diaspora, and then I was educated in France and Italy and UK and whatever. Anyways, I married in my late 20s. I married a Ukrainian lady, a Ukrainian Jewish girl who I met as a student in Paris. In my 20s, in my mid 20s, I met a beautiful Ukrainian Jewish girl who was educated in France, and we started living in between France and Ukraine. And I slowly converted to the Ukrainian diaspora, living in France with my Ukrainian wife. We spoke Russian at home, but we both know French. Her French is perfect. My French is workable. She's also a Ukrainian speaker, so we would go back and forth between speaking Russian and French in Paris. And I quickly became acculturated to Ukraine, and I spent 12 years reporting in Ukraine. And I ran a TV station in my early 30s, a Ukrainian TV station in my early 30s. And then when the war started, we returned to Ukraine, and I reported from there, and we started a magazine. So as it happens, we also have European passports. We're very complicated. I won't tell you how many passports I have, but I have one less as of last week.
Yeah, so let's build up to the burning, because I think when you have a fire, you want a crescendo to the fire.
Yes. Ben's good at this type of thing. We have to trust him. Also, I just want to say like how much I love the idea of like this like Ukrainian, like Russian, New Yorker, like Uzbeki couple hanging out in Paris trying to talk French.
You are the second person of my acquaintance who's Jewish Ukrainian born in Uzbekistan.
Who's the first?
A legal scholar friend of mine who writes for Lawfare sometimes.
What's his name?
Her name. I don't actually.
We're gonna
I want to be
withhold it.
careful with people's privacy, so I'm happy to tell you offline, but I'd rather not. So I want to ask
Cool.
about your. So the story you've just told is like super normal for Eastern European Jews of a certain generation, and a little bit unusual for people of our generation.
Correct. That's right.
And so, I mean, if this was our grandparents' generation, the story you just told makes all the sense in the world. And, borders moved, people moved, they're, ended up in Paris, ended up in New York, how, before 2 weeks ago, tell me about how you constructed your identity. Were you an American of Russian descent? Were you a Eastern European Jew? I mean, how did you think of, how did you describe yourself?
It's all very confusing when you're younger. So it's all very confusing when you're from everywhere and nowhere when you're younger. But I grew up firmly rooted in post-Soviet Russophone culture, and I grew up in a Jewish household, and I had a firm sense of myself as a diaspora Russian, and I studied Russian literature in university, and I knew a lot of Russian-speaking poets, and I translated poetry into English from Russian when I was in my early 20s. I grew up in the Russian intelligentsia in New York City, the Russophone intelligentsia in New York City, and I grew up in a fairly prominent man's. My parents were divorced, so I wasn't really growing up with my father, but my father's a prominent Russian American media guy and politician, and so I always knew that I was a Russian of a kind. But we were Jewish, and we were post-Soviet, and we were born in Uzbekistan, so it's complex, and no one really talked about the nuances so much in my Brooklyn youth in the 90s and the early aughts, or parsing out whether you were Russophone, Jewish, Ukrainian, or Belarus Ukrainian, or whatever. It didn't really matter.
Okay, but at
wait,
some
can
point,
I ask a quick follow up? I just want to ask, what neighborhood in New York did you grow up in? That actually will help me. Brighton Beach.
Bay,
Okay.
and then once we got a little bit more money, we lived in chicer places. But I absolutely grew up in Brighton Beach.
Brighton Beach, the only neighborhood in the United States where you can buy kvass on the street.
So that's right.
So help me out though. You said you described at some point in your 20s converting to Ukrainian heritage or being a Ukrainian American. You're not a Ukrainian speaker. You married a Ukrainian, but you're still Russophone. Walk us through that identity shift. What does it mean?
I had to learn Ukrainian in order to do my work, even though I don't really speak it on TV or anything like that. I'm not saying my Ukrainian is perfect or even great, but I had to learn to read and listen to and know Ukrainian when I was, and speak it basically in order to do my work. And now I'm going to have to get my Ukrainian up to perfect, which I've just been a little lazy to get it up from 75 up to 100%, because operating at 75% capacity of Ukrainian and being a native Russian speaker, I could do my work perfectly well in Ukraine until now. After this war, I'm going to have to get my Ukrainian up to perfect speed in order to be able to continue doing what I do as a Ukraine hand, which I think is really interesting.
Okay, so talk about that conversion. You went from thinking of yourself as, a product of post-Soviet Russian culture in the United States to being sort of post-Soviet Ukrainian in the United States or in Kiev. Walk us through that. What's the difference between those two identities?
Well, look, I passed obviously what I've done is cast my lot with the Ukrainian political nation. And, lots of people, lots of Russians are going to wind up doing the same. In fact, Russian speaking democratic culture, Russian democracy only exists in three places. It existed in St. Petersburg and Moscow, in certain precincts, in certain kitchens, and certain institutions. It existed in the diaspora where I grew up, in London, in Germany, in Tel Aviv, in Brighton Beach, in San Francisco, a huge Russian speaking diaspora. And it existed in Ukraine, the only place where millions of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians lived in liberal democracy, however flawed, however, whatever issues, corruption, whatever. The only place where liberal democracy existed outside of Russia, in a liberal Russian-speaking democratic space, was in Ukraine. So, I slowly, over 12 years, cast my lot in with my wife and my Ukrainian friends and the Ukrainian political nation. And even though I don't have a Ukrainian passport yet, eventually, I'll after the war is over, I'll start the process on that. Or even don't need to. I'm an American. I'm living in France. I, like other Russians in the diaspora, have had to make decisions about where I stand vis-a-vis the Putin regime, vis-a-vis being a member of a Russian diaspora. There are hundreds of thousands of people like me, and they're going to be making decisions. A lot of them aren't going to be as consequential as me, as actually standing in front of a Russian embassy in Paris with Thomas Ilves holding the lighter. I mean, that's pretty radical. But there will be many thousands, if not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Russians who will make certain decisions not unlike those in the coming weeks.
So tell us the story. You are living in Paris. You're married to a Ukrainian woman. You're
Yep.
not Ukrainian, but you've kind of emotionally converted to the Ukrainian cause. Russia invades Ukraine. How did you come to be with Tomas in front of Tomas, who's a frequent guest on and audience member of the show, and a good friend? How did you come to be with him, burning your Russian passport in front of the Russian embassy in Paris?
So the war begins. I'm sitting around high-end hotel lobbies in Kiev with the rest of the journalist pack, the journo pack, as the saying goes. We're sitting around waiting for the wars to start. It was obvious that the war would begin soon enough, and I didn't really think it would be. I'm deep down inside, I knew, and I told people off the record that I thought it would be a full scale. But I really, like other people, thought that it would be rational. They would just have a dirty war in the Donbass and in the south. I didn't think they'd go all out on a full scale attack against the entire country. I didn't think they would be foolish enough to try to take Kiev with an undermanned force without using their air force. I didn't like the Ukrainian government, by the way. I didn't think they'd be stupid enough to do this in that way with a delusional plan with unachievable objectives. I'm not the only one that made that mistake. The defense minister of Ukraine also made that mistake. So that was an understandable mistake to have made. You can't really predict that the Russians are going to be so delusional as to try to reach unreachable objectives with an undersized manpower force. But the war begins, and it's the 25th, and my wife, who's back in Paris, calls me in Kiev. She's weeping, and she says, I want you to rip up or burn your Russian passport. Would you do that for me? And I didn't think about it. I said, yes, I will. And once I said I will, I had to do it.
So you did it for your wife, not for, I thought you did it for Tomas. Like, I thought, like, I'm like very, like, I feel a little bit like, these types of ultimatums in a relationship are a little unhealthy, but like generally speaking, like, but like here I kind of get it. But
it wasn't an ultimatum. No, it wasn't an ultimatum. No, we're on the same wavelength. My wife and I, we're totally on the same wavelength. It's not an ultimatum, I wouldn't say.
So like, I mean, but also like so when you decided to go and do this, you decided it would be worthwhile to make it into a political statement, obviously, and to make it like a moment of protest. And so how did that end up kind of coming to fruition?
So it didn't happen immediately because I was reporting in Kiev and in Ukraine for the first 3 weeks of the war. I didn't get back to Paris until March 12th. I took my wife's relatives, the women in her family. I took them out of Moldova uh, into Bucharest. I got them laissez-passés because they didn't have working passports. They'd never been, the mother had a working passport, but the grandmother hadn't been on an airplane in 30 years. And the two little girls, my little nieces, they'd never traveled, so they didn't have passports. So we had to get them to the French embassy in Bucharest in order to get them laissez-passés issued by the French embassy. I was reporting for 3 weeks. I wound up in Czernowitz. From Czernowitz, I went into Romania over the border as a refugee. And I went into Moldova, picked up the little girls and the mother, took them back to Bucharest. We sat in a hotel room for 5 days waiting for their papers to be processed. I flew them to Paris. I arrived on the 12th, or I think the 13th of March in Paris, and I had dinner that night with my dear friend Claire Berlinski, an American journalist.
Former guest on this show.
We love Claire.
I love
Sorry.
Claire.
She's amazing.
She's
funny as hell.
She's the rare total package. Claire Berlinski is smart as hell, brilliant, world-class brain, analytically perfect, gorgeous woman, so kind, the rare journalist who has tremendous spiritual qualities, so bright, so wonderful as a human being, and giving, hardworking, just a really, really, really amazing human being. And we had dinner with her and Tumas Ilves, although he says Thomas, but he is Estonian. Let's call him Tumas. And we're having dinner. I said, I'm going to the Russian embassy tomorrow to burn my passport. Would you do the honors? And he says, absolutely. I've never done this before, but let's do this. We get together. I called my Chechen cameraman. When I was the head of Ukraine 24, Ukraine Today in Paris, I had a Chechen cameraman, a very funny guy, and I call him, and I said to my Chechen cameraman, I won't call his name in public because he's family back in Chechnya. And I said, let's say Rustam is his name. Let's say Ahmed Rustam. That's not his real name. Ahmed Rustam. I'm going to burn my Russian passport in front of the embassy tomorrow. Are you available to work? And he says, I'm available, and if it's burning the Russian passport, I don't need to be paid. I said, no.
That's amazing. That's really a great story.
I'll pay you, man. Just be there at 3:00. And he offered to work for free, but I did pay him for the work because one should be paid for work. And so we arrived there, and the Russian embassy is surrounded by French gendarmes who are guarding it, and we did it from across the street. They saw us doing it, and they saw us with the camera crew and with the president of Estonia in a three-piece suit, and
and a bow tie. Don't forget his bow tie. Don't be remiss about the bow tie.
Yeah, it's no joke dressed for the occasion.
We both dressed up, yeah. The French gendarmes didn't care. Since we're doing it across the street, they didn't bother us.
And so tell me about this. What was there any reaction from the embassy, or was it? I mean, my experience with the Russian embassy in Washington is what goes on beyond its gates may as well be in a different world. That there's, it's a self-contained world, and they see what happens outside because they undoubtedly have surveillance of it, but they're not. Did it provoke any kind of reaction at all?
Well, it's not every day that a member of the Atlantic Council burns his Russian passport wearing a suit next to a guy wearing a three-piece suit and the bow tie.
I'm not diminishing the occasion. I'm just asking about whether there was any visible reaction from the Chekists inside.
None. But my very practical and pragmatic wife went up to the Russian embassy with her little blonde angelic daughter, nieces, and put a pro-Ukrainian sticker on the wall. And two security guards ran out, a Russian one and a French guy. And the French guy screams, "Madame, Madame, c'est interdit, you can't do this, blah, blah, blah." And my wife is the most practical, pragmatic, even-tempered woman you'll ever meet. She's very practical, very pragmatic. She's not a person who's very intensely emotional. She's a person who understands everything. She's a moderate, a centrist in every way. And she, it's the war, so she's very, high strung because of the war. And she starts screaming it at the French security guard, "Assassin, assassin, assassin."
That's pretty great.
Get away.
Everyone has their limits. This is correct.
Totally.
This is
Totally.
Yeah, this is wonderful.
Yeah.
I love this story.
A very practical, moderate, even-keeled, even-tempered wife who is a centrist and a moderate and a model liberal and just temperamentally most moderate person who doesn't like anything too intense. She's the opposite of me. I'm, of course, extremely passionate, temperamental, tempestuous man. So, it works well. But she starts screaming at the security guards, "Assassin, assassin, assassin." And the French guard, he says, "Madame, stop doing this." And he takes a camera out and starts taping my wife. I wasn't there when this happened. And she starts screaming at him in French, "You think you have honor, you low-bred mediocrity, taping a woman and two blonde 9-year-old little girls? Where is your masculinity? Where is your honor? What would your wife do?"
That goes over really well with the gendarme, let me tell you.
I'm not like being emasculated by it. And my wife looks like a bourgeois French woman with very nice clothes, and she just starts screaming at him in the most perfect way. "You think you have honor, putting your camera in the face of a woman and her two little girls? Who taught you to behave yourself? Do you have penis in between your legs? Do you have balls?" She said to him in French. And the Russian security guy just looks at her with total contempt, and my wife just screams at him, "Assassin, assassin," and they didn't like this.
So what has the reaction been? I mean, there was a little bit of a news event around it. Thomas tweeted it. You tweeted it. There was some attention. What was the reaction?
So the reaction's been very interesting. The reaction from the Russian diaspora, my friends, even from people who are liberal-minded or people who are wealthy, who are living in London and New York and Tel Aviv, a lot of them are very supportive. Some of them have pursed lips. They're like, Putin's bad, but this is really kind of déclassé. Amongst Ukrainians, it's been uniformly, you're a hero or you're a mensch. And it's very funny because they keep calling me, my Ukrainian friends from back in Kiev or Odessa, and they say, first of all, a lot of them say, "I didn't even know you had a Russian passport." I didn't really go around telling people. And B, they're saying congratulations, but they say it in this kind of ritualistic way, that in the way that people say happy bar mitzvah or congratulations on finishing university, or congratulations on finishing your master's degree or finishing law school. Congratulations on being a real person. So congratulations. So that's one thing. CNN and MSNBC and NBC did pieces about this, and I was kind of a poster boy for the Russian diaspora who said, "No more, so больше не хочу, no more, basta, aret." And a lot of people noticed that this happened, and a lot of people thought it was great. A lot of people in the Ukrainian diaspora thought it was great that a son, a poster child of the Russian diaspora would say, "No more, I'm a Ukrainian now." Nothing from the embassy. They didn't call me. They didn't,
So, dumb question. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, no, mine's a very serious kind of question, and it's a little bit adjacent to this. So go.
So years ago, I challenged Putin to a fist fight. This was long before Elon Musk did. And Dmitry Peskov was asked to answer this challenge at the Kremlin daily briefing. He said he'd never heard of me. And I would not go to Russia today as a result, or even 3 years ago, as a result of this. And so my question is, when you did this, did you assume you are not, you could not anymore travel to Moscow? You could not, that this is, in a very literal sense, burning ties with the country?
Absolutely, absolutely. I know very well now that I'm a member of the Atlantic Council, and I was on the advisory board of two organizations which are on the non-friendly organization list. I knew very well that I would be tailed or whatever, probably had an unpleasant conversation in the airport. Now I know that I've pronounced myself to be an enemy of the state and an enemy of this regime. I know I will never see Russia again while Putin is alive. I know that while this Chekist regime is in power, and even if he dies and someone of his circle takes over, but I will not see Russia again until this is all over, until there's a liberal democracy or something happens. It's absolutely the burning of a travel document and of an identity and of responsibility to the state and of a possibility of ever setting foot in Russia ever again. I've also made myself a target to the extent that if they want to do something, let them come at me.
Well, that was actually so I have a couple of questions, but actually I'm just going to pick up on Ben's question because I think this is it's kind of close to where I was going. But I'm curious, this type of movement against, not movement, but protest. I don't know, they might consider it movement. This type of kind of outward protest is something that we enjoy in the United States, but there has been for a long time kind of the understanding, obviously, that the tentacles are very, very long, and they have. I mean, it's also a question of how many fronts can they fight at the same time. So
Yeah.
I don't know that right now they're super interested in coming after you, for instance. But once things settle down in Ukraine and things get settled, maybe they'll go and clean up kind of other types of messes or something else. And are you concerned about that? And does that kind of impact how you're planning on kind of conducting them? And I don't give too much detail, but does that kind of make you concerned?
Look, I move around just my lifestyle, my journalism, my way of life. I move around so much. Good luck finding where I am going to be tomorrow. I usually just sleep in a different place every 2-3 nights anyway. Good luck finding me, figuring out where I am. I usually don't spend more than a week in any one country anyway, and I have very few patterns that you could figure out where I am anyway. But listen, if they want to kill me, they can kill anybody. They're not going to be able to kill me on the territory of the United States, and they do kill routinely people on the territory of Europe. They haven't, as far as I know, killed American citizens yet. I mean, Russians don't kill anyone in America, even former Russian intelligence agents, and America does not kill people in Russia, as far as we know. That's the unspoken deal. I mean, that might be off as a month ago. And they've killed lots of people, Georgians and Chechens in Germany, in France, defectors, all sorts of people do get murdered. I mean, you're going to come after a fairly well-known journalist who's a member of the Atlantic Council from a Russian media family with an American passport in France. People would notice. I have some friends who like me and care about me. They would write pieces. That would be an escalation. I am both, at least to the old rules, too well protected by my institutional affiliations to be killed, and I'm not Kasparov either. And so I'm not personally afraid for my own safety. I'm more afraid for the safety of my friends and relatives all over Ukraine. Uh, but if they come after me, if they kill me, that's life. Um, you know, one has to live like a Klingon. And from
So
time to time, you know,
I'm interested in your journalism. Your your you've had a quite interesting and separate from this or connected to this, a quite interesting and diverse journalistic career. Talk about it a little bit. What is the Odessa Review, and you've referred to your reporting, but who are you as a journalist for those who don't know your work?
thank you for asking that. I straddle the fence between being a culture guy and a politics guy, and every culture writer and every pure writer will always wants to be a political writer and go political. I write a lot for Foreign Policy magazine. I write a lot for. I used to write more for the Atlantic Council. I write for various places like the Bulwark on Unheard. I'm Tablet Magazine's European culture correspondent. I love Tablet Magazine. It's a wonderful magazine.
Tablet's
Uh,
great. It's amazing. Yeah, I didn't know that you wrote for them, but that's amazing. That like is a credit to them that they have you writing for them.
I'm the European culture correspondent. I'm a columnist. I've written 200 pieces for them. I write a lot about Ukrainian Jewish affairs. That's something that I was well known for before this. It just happens to be very niche and less important now before than it is now because you have a Jewish president of Ukraine fighting a Russian president who's doing about denazification. Um, I wrote a book about Ukraine and Odessa called "From Odessa with Love." Uh, Please read it if you're into culture and politics. It's very useful for a lot of what's gone on over the last 8 years. I'm putting out a new book about Ukrainian Jewish relations and the birth of a political nation from Columbia Ibadim in about 2 months. There's a lot about Zelensky in there, what Zelensky means as a world historical personage. Oh, there's someone else going on. Who is this?
Oh, sorry.
We're bringing in audience
We
questions.
bring in
Oh,
audience questions, so audience members are interested. But let me just put a link quickly to from Odessa with love into the chat.
But while we have you on the subject of Odessa, because I
yes.
think
Yeah.
this is you're I think the first person, with the possible exception of Alina Polyakova, who's kind of who's been on the show, who's in a position to talk about this. If you identify 10 cities in the history of Jewish civilization that are important, Odessa is one of them.
Absolutely.
And I'm interested. Your like contemporary Odessa is post World War II. Odessa is not so much in the Jewish consciousness, but you wrote a book called Odessa From Odessa with Love. So talk about Odessa as a Ukrainian city, as somebody who wrote about it or who edited the Odessa Review, as a contemporary modern Jewish convert to Ukrainianism.
Okay, that's a lot there. Thank you so much. I think you really understand the importance of the city. I mean, look, Odessa is just the city of the Haskalah. It's the city of the conversion of the Jew into the Russian. It's an important city for Ukrainian history. It's important for Ukrainian political history. It's important for the Black Sea region. It's a city where a lot of important people in the world were born. It is a city that produces some really interesting people who go off and do other things. It's the city where Zionism as a political project in the post-Soviet space or in the Russian Empire was born. Jabotinsky's from there. The first mayor of Tel Aviv is from there. It's a really important city. It's a really important town. Still, I mean, there's still tremendous Jewish life, both secular and religious there, and it's still a city that grips the imagination, even though it's living off of its past a lot of a time. It's still a tremendously important town for understanding the way things work, understanding security arrangements in the Black Sea region, for understanding history, for understanding the future, for understanding what a melting pot Ukrainian identity will look like. So I really love the city. Peter Pomerantsev actually wrote the preface to my first book. I don't have it in front of me, and he basically said, to go from Odessa to Brighton Beach is one thing, but to go from Brighton Beach back to Odessa, this is the genius of the age, reverse immigration flows, and you really have to understand.
Well, Ben is laughing, but I've never been to Odessa. I have no understanding for it. So I was actually going to I didn't want to cut you off because you were kind of but I'm curious, what do you mean by that? What is kind of, let me kind of ignorant me, a little bit in on the joke of what is happening when you have, when you're saying to go from Brighton Beach to Odessa. I mean, I assume that what you mean is that there is this richness in Odessa, and it's a derivative kind of village, kind of immigrant version,
but it's also going backwards in the immigration chain.
Oh,
right.
Okay, got it. Yeah, okay.
Brighton Beach is known as Little Odessa. Brighton Beach is known as Little Odessa because of the tremendous number of Odessans who settled in Brooklyn, in New York City. Many of them became very famous, like the comedian Smirnoff. I don't know if you know. I don't know if you remember that guy Smirnoff from the. Yeah, he's a friend of mine.
Cool.
Yeah, he's pretty cool.
That's really okay. So Tom,
can you hear me?
Yep.
Hey Ben, I really want to compliment you on your argument with Marcy. You're looking a lot better today, but I just really enjoyed that. I thought it was great. So get that.
Well, thank you. It was a good conversation, and I appreciated her coming on and doing it with me.
Yes. Now let me get to my question, and I don't. How do you? Vladislav, is that how you pronounce your name? Vlad, you go by short? I lost him.
You're muted, Vlad.
Okay. Listen, I don't know, this may not be your area. It's a sort of a military strategy question. But I had some friends in Ukraine, and they are distraught. I mean, they are seriously just morbidly distraught right now. They think that the country's going to go into rubble. And and I've been thinking about the Russian pullback a little bit around Kiev, and maybe more going to the east and stuff like that. And I was just thinking, if the United States is serious, and I don't know, Ben, I can't get a read on this, about saving Ukraine. Okay, I realize they don't want to start World War III. I got that part. We've been living with World War III for 70, 80 years. Okay, but nonetheless, do you think that the United States should really step up the defense of Ukraine, like Patriot missiles, M1 tanks? I mean, really give them the stuff. Do you think that would? I don't know. I'm not an expert on this. But it just seems if we need to save Ukraine, which I think we do, I think it's actually a moral and now existential imperative that we save the country somewhat. Do you think we really ought to, as United States citizens, and I think you are, step up now and really give them a lot of defense? Not offense, defense. That's my question.
Vlad, do you want to get started?
Yeah. That's a great. Yeah, look, we're all distraught. We're watching our friends and relatives get killed. I have 3 acquaintances who were killed in the last 2 weeks in the arts. A Lithuanian filmmaker, who I knew, who made a film about Mariupol and became famous as a filmmaker about Grozny. Mantas, his unpronounceable Lithuanian name. I'm so sorry. Mantas Kvadravičius, was killed in Mariupol, evacuating. Max Levin, a, a Russian speaking Jewish patrimony Ukrainian, was killed. A photojournalist taking pictures in Bucha. A guy that my wife knew, a Korean Ukrainian actor, a good looking guy in his early 30s, 33-year-old TV actor by the name of Pasha Lee. He was killed evacuating kids out of Irpin. He was a guy who joined the territorial defenses, the territorial defense battalions. He was evacuating little children when he was shot by a Russian sniper in Irpin. I personally know 3 people who were killed in the last 2 weeks. It is absolutely horrifying when everyone you know, everyone you've ever met at a party, at a dance, at a bar, at a club, at a social event, at the movies, has to run away to another country, and you have to help them get settled. When you have to get your people out, absolutely horrible. So yes, I absolutely think that the Americans should give the Ukrainians absolutely every weapon that they need in order to win this war. They are fighting for the security of Europe. They're ultimately fighting for the security of America. This is a direct challenge and a final challenge to the post-war consensus, and we need to step up and help the Ukrainians win. I was speaking at a Razom for Ukraine fundraiser a week ago. It was amazing. I flew into New York to give a couple of speeches and to help people raise money in order to help with various events, in order to speak at this fundraiser. And the guy speaking after me, a friend of mine from back in Odessa, a port guy who owns the port. He's one of 2 brothers who inherited the port from their father, who built a port business in the 90s. His name is Andrei Stavnitzer. Great guy, head of humanitarian logistics for half the country now, really doing a lot. He spoke after me at this fundraiser for Razom for Ukraine, which everyone should give money to. Please find Razom for Ukraine website. Although the founder today at lunch told me that Russian hackers brought down their payment system. I'm sure in 2 days they'll get it back up and you'll be able to send them money. So my friend Andrei Stavnitzer, who spoke after me at this fundraiser, finds out through the webcam on his backyard that there are Russian tanks and howitzers and Uragan type missile systems prepped in his backyard. Can you imagine? He looks at the security camera on his phone and he sees that there are 12 pieces of Russian military technology in his backyard. Do you know what he did? He called the Ukrainian intelligence services and he said the Russians have set up 12 pieces of tech, howitzers, and Uragan grad system in my backyard.
What can they do?
He gave the coordinates of his rooftop to the Ukrainian intelligence services. He called down an airstrike on his own house.
Wow. Yeah, so just
Jesus Christ.
So just
really?
Tom, think about it this way. There's 3 ways to think. It's very rare that you get this in international or security stuff. 3 ways to look at it, and they all point in the same direction. One is the humanitarian. The victim country here is asking for something. You give them what they want. So usually that's the moral instinct to help the victims is in tension with some other victim, with some other issue. Second way to look at it, this is an opportunity to give Putin a bloody nose. If you think about it in very realpolitik terms, right? Your enemy, your adversary, you can bloody him up a little bit. Those are entirely consistent objectives here. And then the third is the international order, defending the integrity of the international order. For purposes of this show, let's call that the Scott Shapiro principle, right? And that points in the same direction too. We don't believe in the acquisition of territory by the use of force. And so it's very rare that all 3 kind of major objectives point in the same direction. that your humanitarian instincts, your sort of victim protection instincts, your self-defense instincts, your realpolitik instincts, and your big picture systemic
use of force,
right, all point in the same direction. There's one factor that counsels in the other direction, which is the fear of escalation. And that's a cautionary note. You got to do it in a way that's not going to escalate into nuclear war, World War III, and all that jazz. But it's actually a relatively simple situation in terms of the alignment of the strategic value and the morality. And, there are lots of things in the world, how do you deal with the Saudis who you need for a bunch of things when they chop up journalists, right? These are questions that put your values and your interests in conflict with one another. This isn't one of those situations. Do you want NATO to be worth anything or not?
That's absolutely, really, really correct. There is no moral ambiguity. Usually in a war between two countries, there is moral ambiguity. I mean, it's not always good against evil, as in World War II, where you have like a purely evil imperialist state that wants to take over the world and execute anyone who's not like them and make lots of other people to slave labor. That's a pure evil situation in any metaphysical sense. Those are really relatively rare. Most situations are one group of people fighting another group of people, and they both have their own moral calculus and their own historical narrative, and they all have a point about whether they lived here for a long time or the other side lived here for a long time. This has no moral ambiguity. This is one country attacking a much smaller country, which they promised to leave alone, and literally blowing up from the sky women and children in order to get them to stop resisting, because they cannot stand the idea that there's a political nation that lives outside of theirs. This is a perfectly black and white situation, right? There is no moral ambiguity, and our strategic interests, and by we I mean, when I say we, I'm not speaking as a Ukrainian, Jewish, Uzbek, Russian, Belarusian, whatever. I'm speaking as an American citizen, as you guys are. There is no ambiguity between our moral interests and our strategic interests of the Ukrainians winning and keeping a strategic buffer zone for our other European allies.
That's the critical point. If you say, what's the right answer morally, it's that the Ukrainians kick the Russians out of occupied land. What's the right answer for the international system? It's that the territorial integrity of Ukraine is respected. What's the right answer for U.S. interests? It's that Russia learn a very grave lesson here that Eastern Europe is not touchable.
And look, I mean, those people who say that Taiwan or other places in the world are next, if we normalize this, if the territorial structures that we set up do not hold, if the post-World War II consensus doesn't hold, there'll be a lot more war. There'll be a lot more dead people. There'll be a domino effect of illiberal war, right? So, that's obvious. So the only interesting question of those three, and we agree on the moral and the strategic, is the political one in terms of not setting off quote unquote World War III, which is the only one where opponents of arming the Ukrainians have any kind of leg to stand on. And there you do have to be careful. I'm not, and no one in Ukraine is calling for Americans to actually do the fighting for the Ukrainians. They have more than enough manpower and more than enough gusto and more than enough fire in the belly to do it themselves. What they're calling for is a no-fly zone in eastern, a no-fly zone which would be administered over Western Ukraine. That's something that could be done by giving them weapons on the ground in order for them to do it themselves. I don't see that Polish or German or Greek fighter pilots have to actually engage Russian or Belarusian MiGs over Ukraine. That probably could lead to World War III.
Yeah, and the Slovaks just gave them the SS 300s. I mean, it's like there's these things are happening A lot of the debate over them is more optical than anything else. The commitment of the West to Ukraine's being able to defend itself is very deep. Kate, we got a few more audience questions, and then we should wrap.
A bunch of them are not appearing on screen, which has made it hard to kind of. But Mike,
talking for another 10 minutes. I don't know how your timing is. You know,
we tend to wrap on time.
Yeah, so we wrap at like 6. So we'll fit in Mike Tolhurst. Please ask your question.
Hello.
Great to have you on.
Thank you. A long-time caller, or long-time watcher, first-time caller. So thank you.
And a long-time Twitter engagement.
Yeah, I love it.
Great to have you on. In lieu of fun, and with me and with Kate. It's good to hear your actual voice.
Thank you. So for a bit of context, I'm a little bit of a dissident from like a kind of a group of folks who are sort of in the realist and restraint camp, and kind of taking a bit of a dissident view. But I think that sort of informs the question I have. In terms of, like, a lot of folks I know are kind of taking this tack that the war is about spheres of influence, security concerns on part of Russia, what you might kind of sum up as Mearsheimer, right? But I've heard a different dialogue saying that the best way to think about so it looks like you've got thoughts on this, where it's about identity, like Ukrainian, Russian, and European, what you might sort of say, like I take from people like Anne Applebaum, or maybe something about your experience. Did you have a view on which narrative is most helpful for like understanding the conflict? And also, secondly, how does and which narrative you choose to interpret it matter for, like, you know, all sorts of other like downstream decisions you might have around the conflict? And thanks, and I will hop off and take the question.
Man, I have strong feelings about that. What I'm curious if they dovetail with yours. What do you think, Vlad?
Well, look, I'm going to give you the thoughts of someone who's got skin in the game. Basically, 2014 was never about NATO. 2014 and the trade deal in 2013 that got the Maidan originally going was about economic integration with Europe, not military integration, and not NATO. There was never a majority of Ukrainians until 2014 or 15 who wanted Ukraine to be in NATO, and that's why the Americans never offered it to them in 2008. You could read Ambassador Piper's memoirs about that. If you really want to understand the diplomatic history of it, that's all in Ambassador Piper's memoirs. I think it's called The Trident and the Eagle. I did a very long interview with him for the Odessa Review. You could just Google that. It's 8,000 words long, and he explains in detail about the way that the politics went down on that. But it was never about NATO. It was about the sphere of influence, in the sense that Moscow, in a chauvinist way, thinks that Ukraine is part of a Russian political nation, a Russian wider empire. They just don't think that Ukrainians are real people and that Ukrainian political nation exists outside of Russia. They cannot have that exist. And it's about corruption. It's about not cleaning up the way that Ukraine governs itself. It's about a multi-ethnic empire which governs by centralized authoritarian control in Moscow, not being able to live with a multi-ethnic nation that lives in a chaotic and liberal and democratic way on its periphery, because its own citizens will demand better governance. So it was never about the Mearsheimer realist view of a legitimate sphere of influence, because NATO was never on the table. No Ukrainians wanted NATO. I think in 2012 it was like 25 or 30% of the Ukrainian political nation that wanted to be part of NATO. So I don't buy it. This is about destroying the Ukrainian political nation, not about NATO or legitimate spheres of influence.
I would just add to that the fundamental narrative through which to understand this is decolonization. That the Soviet Union was essentially an empire.
What a good way to, that's a good
Reagan had it right when he said it's an evil empire. It was evil, but more importantly, the noun here is empire. And as the Soviet Union collapsed, the first colonies to actually completely detach were the Eastern European states that had been invaded in the post-war era, Poland, the Baltics, Czechoslovakia, which were not Russian-speaking, which were actually colonized, and Russia could absorb that because it didn't go to the fundamental narrative that there was a kind of pan-Russian speaking brotherhood. Ukraine poses a unique problem in this regard, in that it is the ultimate seat of the Rus. It's where Russian culture sort of comes from. It is Russian-speaking, sort of. Russia does not acknowledge that Ukrainian is a real language, that Ukraine is a separate country. And to remove Ukraine from the Russian orbit attacks the notion, the way great Russian nationalists think about what Russia is. And they have been incredibly brutal over a long period of time in trying to prevent that. And this is a continuation of that. It's fundamentally an anti-colonial narrative that's best understood by, I don't know, there's a pale version of it in the relationship between England and Ireland. But you have to go through for hundreds of years back before you get to the intensity of it.
I'd like to, I absolutely agree with all of that. And in order to understand this theory much better, I really recommend the work of Sergei Plokhy, The Last Empire. He compares it to the collapse and dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, which took 30 years. It was only over 1945, the final dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. The dissolution of the Soviet Empire is only concluding now, 30 years later. That's absolutely true. Mr. Witt, you're a very, very wise man. You understand things very correctly. But it's not the Irish in relationship to the British and the English. It's the English and the Scottish. That's the relationship between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Scottish were junior partners in an imperial project. They were also sometimes equal and sometimes under the boot of the English. The Irish would be like the Belarus or the Armenians or the Chechens. You had other constituent people in the empire who were the stock of lower class hierarchy. The Ukrainians to the Russians are as the Scottish were to the English.
That's an interesting corrective, and I buy it.
Yeah. Can you say a little bit more though, Ben? Like, what made you go to the Irish in the first place?
Well, I mean, I think what Ukraine and Ireland have in common is that the relationship, that the resistance had to become violent in a way that just isn't true of modern Scotland. But the persistence of the relationship and the sort of junior partner aspect of it, I agree with Vlad, has a very kind of Scottish feel. The difference is that Scotland has historically vacillated between an independence movement and feeling part of the UK. And there is no analog to that. Like, Ukraine, Russians assert that there is a Slavic brotherhood of nations between Ukrainians and Russians, and Ukrainians, even a lot of Russian-speaking Ukrainians, in my experience, simply don't share that understanding of it.
Sure.
Yeah, I was going to say that I thought the reason you went to Ireland was because of the express and very vocal kind of push for independence that Ireland launched.
Yeah,
and that seemed like the easy kind of layup. And I get what you're saying, and then I kind of understood what he was saying in terms of the corrective. But you do have to understand that Ireland continues to have Scotland does not have the move for independence, but Ireland. Anyway,
Scotland has a contemporary move for independence. It does not have the same kind of struggle that Ireland has, particularly 100 years of sometimes violent struggle. And I look, all analogies fail ultimately. All I'm trying to say is, if you look at Ireland from an English perspective, you see, well, they speak English, they pretend to have this other language,
right,
but nobody actually speaks it. And if you look at Ireland from an Irish perspective, they say, we have 1,000 years of our own culture that they've imposed a superstructure on top of. And that's very much the way Ukrainians talk about.
correct.
And I think there's just some similarity there. What's missing in the Irish case is the occasional genocidal actions by the.
They would argue that the potato famine was just that. They would argue that there were genocidal incidents. I mean, look.
Yeah, that's not wrong. That's completely correct. Yeah.
The violent resistance is the Irish part. But they were not, the Irish until the 20th century were not within the status hierarchy of the British Empire on the level of the English, whereas Russified Ukrainians in the Russian Empire and in the Soviet Union were able to achieve the highest levels of leadership.
Right.
You had,
And was this
you
just
had-
based entirely on dialect and kind of like accent, or like was it like just like it was, or was it background, or like did people sorry, I don't mean to ask a really complicated question.
The language was repressed. I mean, Ukrainian was systematically repressed for hundreds of years.
Yeah,
I
but
mean, there were.
Yeah, I guess it's like kind of a question of well, we should actually just have you back on and talk about this point, and like maybe we should do that like.
The language issue is super, super interesting.
Yeah,
because it's kind of a language continuum that starts in Poland and kind of turns into Russian by the time you get to Kharkiv, but there's a lot of different shades in between. I mean, I don't.
Why don't we come back? I will tell you one other person. Maybe we can do another show just on the language. Well, there's no language issue.
Yeah, that would be great. We could also
Let's
have
do
Ben
that.
on then. That would be great. Like that would be really fun.
To mix it with the Scots.
To mix it with the Scots, but we have to wrap. We will be back on Monday. I do not know who. I think I do know who Scott and I have coming on, but it's not public yet. And we were having but it will be great, of course, and it will be at 5 p.m. And until then, Ben?
Well, until then, first of all, Vlad, you're a great American, a great Ukrainian, a terrible Russian, apparently. But
really great.
We love you
French.
for it. And a great Frenchman.
I will not yet, but I'm grateful. I'm grateful to be on here. I'm grateful for your interest in Ukraine. I'm grateful for your good work. I followed your writing for a long time. I was grateful to be asked. I'm very popular, unfortunately, nowadays. Area experts become very popular in times of war. I wish it was not so. I would trade all the attention in the world for the fact that I wouldn't have to get my father-in-law out of Odessa next week. But having put 12 years of my life into Ukraine, I have responsibilities to the country. It's a great country. Slava Ukraini. Thank you so much. And I'll be back to talk about language.
We are going to do that. Thank you for all you've done and for joining us today. And until then, Kate, we don't have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we have these multinational stories of complex identities that shift in response to. Whoa, I'm getting massive.
I fixed it.
We have these complicated, multi-factor, identities that shift in response to geopolitical events, and part of our identities are matters of choice, and we express those choices by doing things like burning passports. So, you get to decide who you are.
Or blowing up your
Vlad,
own house. Some people
Or
burn your
blowing
house
up
down.
your own house.
or blowing up
Some
your own house, which I like.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a crazy story. Oh my God.
It's a
Okay, I'm
secret.
gonna. Bye, guys. Have a great weekend. Vlad, I hope I get to meet you in New York City sometime.